Today, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and Ohio Senator J.D. Vance have agreed to a debate on October 1st. The Trump campaign has brought back Corey Lewandowski to advise the senior leadership team. And will the far left riots break out outside the Democratic National Convention next week? We have all those stories and so much more. Blaze News Tonight starts right now. Welcome to the chaos. I'm Jill Savage. Today is Thursday, August 15th. Well, it's official. Vice presidential contenders Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and Ohio Senator J.D. Vance have agreed to debate on October 1st. Here to discuss is Matthew Peterson, editor-in-chief for Blaze News, and Chris Bedford, senior editor for politics and Washington correspondent for Blaze Media. So, Chris, let's dive into this. What are your predictions? What are we going to see with the vice presidential matchup now that we know that it's happening?
I'm looking forward to this. This is going to be the perfect matchup. And if there were any heebie-jeebies the Trump campaign had about all the flack they've taken over years-old comments from J.D. Vance, I suspect that this will dispel them. One of the things that Walz has been unable to shake is not fake news like that silly couch thing, but real news, which is that he appears to have dodged his tour in Iraq. When his soldiers were mobilizing to move out, the ones who he'd commanded, he did not do it. And worse than that, he misrepresented himself. Now, a lot of folks would be shut down on these sorts of fronts because you'd have Walz giving the kind of lines we saw him give earlier this week, which is, I'm proud of my service to my country. And to a lot of politicians these days, he could turn to them and say, where were you? I served for 20 years. What have you been doing? Well, J.D. Vance served his country as well in the U.S. Marine Corps. He can fire right back, as he has been doing, and say, it's fine to retire, but when your commanding officer says that you lied about it, and you let the troops down, and it was actually a good thing because it ended up with a better CO in combat, when he's coming back and saying, you say you carried a weapon of war in war, which is a lie. That's someone who's really able to take an issue that is stuck to Walz. And at the same time, J.D. Vance comes from a similar part of the country and a similar background, where he's able to look at the destruction that you saw in Minnesota and Minneapolis during 2020 under Walz's watch, point the finger at him. It's going to be a difficult time, and I suspect that for all the heebie-jeebies that Republicans had over these last couple of weeks over choosing a conservative vice president, that'll be dispelled by the fact that the Democrats outdid themselves. This is not a ticket that you traditionally see. Even Barack Obama ran using the language of Ronald Reagan. Even though his policies were liberal, his language was conservative. Joe Biden did the same thing. His policies have been even more liberal, but his language was very conservative. Kamala Harris and Walz have not even tried to do that. They're just being openly left-wing. That's a lot of confidence. That's fine. They want to raise the banners high, but it opens up a lot of lines of attack that a lot of American voters aren't going to buy.
So, Chris, one thing you just touched on that's interesting that we need to delve into more because it's going to become a central theme in the next few months between these two men is the image that both have as people who come from the heartland, who grew up in the center of America. And both sides are going to say, the other guy is a pretender. He pretends like, he's a good Minnesotan and he's one of us, but really he's a radical leftist, which he is. And then the other side's going to say, well, fancy college boy, right? He really left Ohio and Mima behind. And this is a common theme in American politics, but as you point out, it's coming into conflict here in a very interesting way. And it's going to be part of the debate. It's going to be in the background of, pretty much the entire election, don't you think?
Yeah, anyone who thinks that J.D. Vance left his family too far behind should have been a fly in the wall the day he got confirmed at the Senate, because they tore it up on Capitol Hill, all his family coming into town. This is actually something I think that will matter. Now, usually the conventional wisdom is that vice presidents don't matter that much. I mean, no one can really remember the debate between Mike Pence and Tim Kaine, for those who even really remember that Tim Kaine is still a U.S. senator. And not many people remember the debate between Mike Pence and Kamala Harris. But here, to your point, You've got one candidate from New York City, now in Florida, another candidate from California, and what they're battling over is what Walz and Vance say that they represent. And that's going to be a core part of the campaign, the things that they're trying to appeal to. So Vance's ability to push back on that is going to be helpful. And for anyone who wants to say that they're going to claim, like I saw when J.D. Vance first was made vice president, there were articles saying he's not really a hillbilly. They were in the Los Angeles Times and a British newspaper. I thought, what exactly gives anyone here the street cred to talk about it? The American people fell in love with hillbilly elegy. They made a movie out of it. You could get it at liberal confabs. I picked up my copy covering a Koch conference. Now, their policies may have diverged pretty massively, but there was a time when everyone in the country, every news program in the country, every Hollywood producer agreed, this guy tells an interesting story because he's the real deal. I don't think Tim Walz is going to be able to tear that down.
No, and we can't emphasize this enough. I mean, it's one of the most incredible things ever happened to J.D. Vance. His story was that good that Hollywood really took it up. Real Hollywood, right? The right never does this. They never make movies about candidates. They do not understand how this works. They don't understand that Ronald Reagan was an actor. They don't understand that Donald Trump was on a reality show for 10 years. And in this case, the left really messed up because they just didn't realize who he was, right? And then he turned against them, and all of a sudden they're quiet about the movie. So this is remarkable that this is happening, right now in this day and age, and he can really use that momentum, I think.
When I first interviewed J.D. Vance, when he was considering running for Senate, he came to our podcast studios in D.C., and my co-host said, I'm one of the only people who didn't like hillbilly elegy. And he said, okay, well, tell me why. And his response was, well, it didn't offer any solutions. You diagnosed a lot of problems. Now, my co-host was well familiar with those problems, but a lot of people in the Beltway in New York City and California were not remotely familiar with just how hollowed out, not just the industry, but the cultures, the towns, the families, the religion, and a lot of our country had been. J.D. Vance brought that to light. Well, now he's got the policies. He's actually, over the last couple of years since he wrote that book, which is much more recollection than it is a policy prescription. It's not a political book. Now he's come up with the policy ideas. Now he's got, hey, here's the things that we need to do. Originally, he didn't like Donald Trump. That's well documented. I think a lot of people feel the same. But now he saw what he did in those first 4 years. He saw it was actually pushing back. He saw the enemies that it made. And he is now about as full-blown a believer as you're going to find in U.S. politics at the federal level.
Well, we've seen Kamala Harris come out, and any policies that she's had is basically anything that Donald Trump has already said, right? Like the no tax on tips. Now she's going back, Chris, to the 1970s because she's expected to call for a federal ban on corporate price gouging tomorrow. So how can we just come out here and say that we're going to implement federal price controls in 2024, Chris?
I think it's going to be a hard thing for them to push. The inflation that they caused, that everyone knows they caused, mix that with actual price controls. That's not how you solve inflation. Now, solving inflation is extremely painful. Whoever wins this election is going to have to deal with a very difficult thing because right now, while it's really expensive to buy things, for those people who do, if inflation is actually reversed in any meaningful way, they're going to find a difficult time selling them and making their money. There's going to be some pain there. And there's always the temptation to go back to planning and say, well, the government knows best. The government knows best. I mean, I think the best example of this would probably be the different economic turns that Eastern Bloc countries took after the collapse of the Soviet Union. There's some pain for those who went with the market. And there's going to be certainly an impulse in both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris to try and lessen that. And the federal government can do what they can. But when you get too involved, well, that just reeks of that old-fashioned hardcore liberalism, the kind of thing that this country is generally rejected, the economic history is generally rejected, and that opens them up to a whole bunch more.
It definitely does. Now, don't go anywhere, Chris, because when we get back, we're going to talk about, one, the treehouse that you're coming to us from, but two, the familiar face that's returning to the Trump campaign. We will be weighing the pros and cons of bringing back Corey Lewandowski. You don't want to go anywhere. Much like the inflation problems of the 1970s, Americans are hurting financially right now, and healthcare costs are one of the biggest issues that they deal with. But guess what? What if I told you there is some answer for you that's not even just the regular healthcare system, because we know that doesn't work for so many people. Well, there is Lassie Health here to shake things up. That's LAASY. And Lassie Health, they're not health insurance. They're accessible to you for healthcare with all that red tape, the restrictions that come along with this, and all of the inflated costs. And the best part about it is coverage starts at just $30 a month. You'll get the transparent pricing. You'll get the comprehensive coverage that's tailored to your needs for you and your family. They can even do that for your business as well. So you'll have the access to the healthcare services that you need without breaking the bank. And the best part, there's no annual or lifetime caps on the service, and you can start a plan at any time because it's not healthcare. You don't have to wait for the open enrollment period at the most inconvenient time. By the way, in November, December, nobody has time to go out there and sign up for a plan at that point in the year. We're all too busy. But the best part is you get over 400 prescription medications for free unlimited virtual mental health care counseling, free 24/7 virtual urgent care, and so much more. Lassie Health is a game changer. Check out the affordable plans that put you in control of your health at healthlink.com/blaze. For a limited time, get your first month free, up to $100 off eligible plans. So get healthy, be healthy, and stay healthy without breaking the bank at healthylink.com/blaze. The Trump campaign has brought back Corey Lewandowski to advise the campaign's senior leadership team. Now, he previously served as the Trump 2016 campaign manager. Chris Bedford back with us once again. So why the shakeup? Why are we bringing Lewandowski back onto this team?
Well, there's been a couple of hiccups with this campaign, as you can tell. They were caught rather flat-footed when Kamala Harris came out, which is silly. They should have been reading the Beltway brief. They would have known that the only candidate who could replace Joe Biden was Kamala Harris, because Democrats really did want all that money, and they didn't want to have a fight over race and DEI, so the vice president it was going to be. The Trump family has, from the sources I've been talking to, which is quite a few, have been growing increasingly dissatisfied with both LaSavita and Susie Wiles. They've been dissatisfied with the infighting. And, it's not that uncommon to see a shakeup. 2020 saw its first campaign manager fired after the campaign basically ran out of money and then taken over by someone else. 2016 was basically by the seat of their pants campaign. That was just Donald Trump and Corey Lewandowski and a couple others roaming the country and taking heads. Now they wanted to bring someone back to try to restore a little bit of order. Lewandowski is someone who Donald Trump and the family both are very comfortable with. Kellyanne Conway is coming back on. A number of other folks will be joining this campaign. And I think what they're hoping is that he can break up some of the power struggles and some of the jealousy and the power bases that have developed within a campaign that ought to be working more cohesively together. Now, one of Lewandowski's first moves, I've learned on my drive out to this distant hunting lodge, has been to get some of that old gang back together. He's been making phone calls to people who were with him in 2016, people who are trusted by both Donald Trump and him, to come in and not just advise, but to be chairman and to kind of shake up this campaign and get it ready for November.
Chris, we're going to talk about that hunting lodge at the end of this. I'm hoping you're going to give us a tour of whatever's behind you and you're collecting. I thought it might be your basement for a while there, but we'll get to that. So with Lewandowski, it's great that you bring up the past, because people do need to remember, Trump runs through people in these campaigns, and that was 2016. He went through people and he sort of ascended a ladder. And, frankly, I think like a lot of people, I don't give a damn. Whatever gets us there, right, is great. Cycle through all the people you want, just win, baby. But the problem here is, we should delve into why this happened. Why is this change being made?
Well, the rumors that I've heard and the inside stories that I've heard is that the campaign is a bit of a jumbled mess. There are a lot of different power bases who are trying to overshadow each other. Politics is fighting with comms. Comms is fighting with politics. People are sniping each other in the press. It's got all the hallmarks of a dysfunctional campaign, but also something that's not particularly uncommon at a campaign on this level. You're going to have people who are jealously guarding their power. They are looking toward winning. Then they're looking toward the potential role in the future of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party on the other side, what roles they could potentially have in this administration, when really their eyes should be on the ball. Now, La Savita and Susie Wiles, they really brought the promise of order to this campaign. It was going to be professionally run, and these people are both veterans. They really do know how to do this traditionally. But their big selling point, that it would be smooth and professionally run, hasn't borne out. Well, there's no consultant on the planet who's going to be able to tell a 78-year-old billionaire what to do, or make him stop tweeting, or make him do rallies he might not want to do, or not do rallies he might want to do. There are things that they can be counted on. Now, part of the fear of the 2020 experience is that running out of money. And because of that, the campaign chose to not really delve into the organizational ground game, for example, to outsource a lot of their advertising to super PACs right now. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that you can't coordinate with them legally. So it doesn't give the campaign the kind of knowledge that it should have, and the ability to hit where it wants to hit. Another problem is that even in the age of outsourcing, it's kind of like the idea you saw during the Iraq War, that you can just outsource the military's job to contractors. That turns out to not actually be the case. Campaigning is still campaigning, war is still war, and any campaign still needs to actually have a real serious ground game. So that's one thing that Lewandowski came from that realm in New Hampshire. That's one thing he's going to try and bring, and it's one of the things that he's already begun trying to rebuild, is that basic infrastructure, so they're not just reliant on super PACs and the RNC.
That makes a lot of sense, Chris. So infrastructure, let's talk about some other changes that might come out of this. For instance, a lot of people have been upset since the assassination attempt that hasn't been spoken about more, and that there's the messaging right now is a little off. It should be attacking in a different way. What do you think about the future? Are there any hints of the direction in which Lewandowski would try to push things?
I think they're going to try and get down to the bread and bones of this whole thing, if that's an expression. Talk about the economy, talk about safety, talk a little bit about foreign policy, talk about that assassination attempt. I mean, that assassination attempt got a smaller window of press coverage than the Harvard professor who got arrested when Barack Obama was president. It was 1 week of press conference. Now, you can definitely, incorrectly, look at CBS, at ABC, CNN, and the New York Times and say, well, they just don't want to talk about it. They're going to ignore it. But it does take a candidate, and it does take messaging and advertising to really push that through. Now, it has gotten through at some levels in the culture. For example, I was with my family on the Ocean City Boardwalk last week, where all these cheap T-shirt factories sell these shirts that you would be very embarrassed for your children generally to buy. All these sorts of silly messages and punk rock things and heavy metal things. But it was kind of shocking. For every T-shirt you saw like that, another one had Donald Trump with his fist in the air and the American flag behind it that said, fight, fight, fight. You saw it everywhere. And this is a place that sold anti-George W. Bush T-shirts. So it has entered some of that kind of grassroots mainstream culture. People are buying it. But the campaign has failed to really talk about the messaging. Now, the campaign is actually spending a lot of money. They're, at this moment, outspending Democrats in television ad buys. They're blanketing the states, not just the campaign itself, which is outspending Democrats, but the outside contributors are also outspending Democrats. And they still haven't been able to get this message through. The focus hasn't been there. And in the fall, Democrats have hundreds of millions of dollars already sent, already paid for these advertisements. They're going to blanket the airwaves. So this is the time for the campaign to really get that back in control. And then lastly, it is difficult to control any candidate. That's not just true for Donald Trump, although it's very true for him. It's true for a House candidate or a Senate candidate. And you always have to be concerned about their headspace. And I was talking to a veteran Republican conservative campaign consultant on the way out here, pointing out it should not be overlooked the impact that it has, the potential post-traumatic stress disorder it has to be shot in the head at a rally surrounded by all these people. I remember watching live when we covered at the Republican National Convention, courage and the fear that might have crossed him. He didn't show any. For Donald Trump, after being shot, to return to public, surrounded by tens of thousands of people in an arena, and the willingness to stay on message, all of these things can be shaken. We have to remember, Trump is not a machine. If your father or your uncle or your friend got shot in the head and was acting completely normal right after that, you would think something was off. So there may be a little bit of that at play as well.
Now, to borrow a line from your newsletter yesterday, we're not in Kansas anymore. So, Bedford, your final word today is, where are you right now?
My favorite place in the world is rural Maryland, where you can do hunting and fishing, and hopefully we'll do a little bit of both once hunting season opens up here. But I drove 2 hours outside of DC to meet with a group of House conservatives and their staff to kind of talk about what's going on in the news cycle and try to learn as much as I can about that. So I'm coming to you via Elon Musk's Starlink from
There you go.
the middle of the marshes.
There it is. We knew it would be a good story. Thanks so much for joining us and taking the time for us out of that, Chris Bedford.
I'll see you in studio tomorrow.
BlazeTV host Ora McIntyre will explain why Western civilization is in shambles. Up next. You might be asking yourself, why is society such a mess? Leftists often claim that it's capitalism or the patriarchy. But Blaze TV host Ora McIntyre has a different diagnosis: liberty without virtue. Oran joins us now to discuss this. So Oran, let's dive right into this. What do you mean by liberty without virtue?
Well, in the United States, we often learn that freedom is the core of who we are, right? But a lot of people looking at a drug addict who's free to do as much heroin as they'd like understands that ultimately that person isn't really operating under liberty. They don't really understand. They're not really in control of who they are. They are a slave to their own desires. And so when we think about liberty, when we think about freedom, it's better to understand that ordered liberty, liberty that is pursuing a specific type of virtue, is ultimately what we're aiming for. And that's really what our founding fathers understood, that it's not liberty by itself, but it is the freedom, the liberty to pursue the good life in a shared moral vision that ultimately is what brings us together as Americans.
Oren, couldn't agree with you more. You stumbled into the hidden recesses of my mind 3 lifetimes ago in a dissertation chapter I wrote on liberty versus licentiousness in the ratification debates.
About to get good.
And I really like the way you laid this out. It feels to me that I really want to get into it. It feels to me that conservatives used to understand this, or that this was sort of common knowledge. Like, if freedom just means freedom to do whatever I want, then we're going to be in a pretty bad way pretty quick. Why do you think we've forgotten this?
Well, I think especially in a more libertarian age, it was easier to sell the right as the party of freedom, the Republicans, the right. We were the people who were looking for free speech, freedom of action. And that was the constant shelling point. But ultimately, that's not a great place to be because, as you said, really, this just ends up having us turn to licentiousness. When people are only pursuing freedom, then they may be free to, again, do drugs or seek whatever kind of sexual perversion they prefer. And they don't really understand that freedom was only really ever a benefit to a people who are working towards a common goal. I think more religious Americans understood this. They understood that while they may have a liberty from government oversight, that liberty only exists because they were pursuing a path of righteousness towards a religious goal, following the laws that God had set before them. But when we just use freedom to mean whatever we want to pursue, we very quickly fall into these terrible places where the country falls apart, because while we're free to pursue the things that we now desire, ultimately these things dissolve the social fabric that was holding us together without the government.
Before we move any further, let's have you define virtue in the context of maintaining a free society.
Well, Aristotle believed that we could only really pursue virtue in communities. Communities are places where we interact with others and we fulfill the roles that we are meant to embody. And so when we're pursuing virtue, we're trying to become the best instantiation of those ways of being, understanding that our roles as fathers or husbands or mothers or children, members of communities, churches, friends, these things all matter. And it's only when we are pursuing those goals as our liberty that we really fulfill it. And ultimately, what we need to do is recognize the best way to be a father, to be a wife, to be a member of a church. And that's often what we have to sacrifice other desires for, even though we technically have the freedom to pursue them.
Let me throw in there. So the old school definition in Noah Webster's dictionary for licentiousness, it was a contempt for just restraint. So in other words, there are certain, it's exactly to your point, there are certain restraints that are just, that help us, just like, a wall helps us. We can do exercises off the wall or the floor. that justice guides us down this path to establish these habits that make us ultimately happy. I want to read you something and just have you respond to it. This is a George Washington, in one of his fine moments after the Revolution, is circular to the states before he goes back to the farm after the Revolution. And he says that there's a natural and necessary progression from the extreme of anarchy to the extreme of tyranny, and that arbitrary power is most easily established on the ruins of liberty abused to licentiousness.
Yeah, that's a great quote. That's really him understanding that once we realize we have this liberty, once we realize the government is not lording over us every moment, we have to maintain that path of virtue, because when we step off it for our own ends, when we decide that, well, yes, I do have this freedom mainly so I can pursue the good, but what if this time I just pursued what I would like best, what feels good in the moment? Once we do this, we start moving towards anarchy. And when we enter that state of anarchy, only someone with a large amount of power can really right the ship. I actually point out in my essay that Machiavelli is somebody who talked a lot about this, that when you have this moment where order has fallen apart because the people have become no longer virtuous, really you end up in a moment where a Caesar or a king must right the ship. You only end up with this Republican virtue after order has been restored. And so if we fall off this path, if we fail to fulfill our roles, our virtuous roles in the community, then the government must step in. And often that's the left's plan, to enable this licentiousness, not because they actually want us to be free to pursue something that would make us happy, which ultimately it doesn't, but more because they want to centralize government power. And they recognize that every time we become less virtuous, we become more reliant on the government to fill in those roles.
So he's throwing out George Washington. You're talking about Machiavellian things. Are there any current figures? Can we bring this in to 2024 that embody any of these virtues, or are we just completely lost?
Well, I'm sure we can think of different virtues that we would appreciate. There are many great religious men still around today. There are, of course, business leaders and politicians. But ultimately, this is really something that has to be created across the population. Again, the thing that brings that threshold of virtue to the point where we can maintain a republic is that it is part of our general religious understanding, our general tradition. If this is just one or two people, it doesn't really do what we needed to do. Perhaps those people can be the kings that we were talking about. That's not really what a lot of people are looking for. They're hoping to maintain that Republican form of government. And as John Adams told us, the Constitution is really only good for a moral and religious people. It doesn't work for any other. So this wouldn't have been alien to the founding fathers. They were a set of people who broke away from England, from having a king, but only after they had established a level of order and virtue inside the United States that would allow for that self-governance. And they knew that if they lost that, if we were relying entirely on the virtue of a couple of people instead of the inculcation across the populace, that ultimately we would become the subjects of those people.
Amen to that. So if you have a king and they go wrong, I mean, that's the problem with monarchy. What happens when the king goes wrong becomes evil. Problem of aristocracy. What happens when the few go wrong? And as you point out here, the founders understood what happens when the many go wrong. The majority in a republic, you lose the form of government, and ultimately it leads towards tyranny. So you say at the end of this article, I find it unlikely that the United States will collectively return to Republican self-governance. But then you advocate for, or you say, there are groups of people who need to come together to do this. Now, to me, that sounds like the only possible way to save the country, to save, the whole republic, would be that people do come together and start to reestablish this sort of virtue. But can you say more about what you mean by this and why you think it's unlikely?
I think at this moment, it's a lot of people are obsessed with freedom, that it is really very difficult to sell the idea that to hold this form of government, something that some people on the right, often conservatives, cherish, but ultimately something I think the left is largely willing to discard. It's pretty hard to sell them the idea that they need to go ahead and start following some form of Christian virtue, some kind of shared moral vision under Christianity in order to retain that Republican virtue. You can still, I think, have small groups of people. You can still have Christian communities that are pursuing and that. And in fact, the point is that whether I'm right or I'm wrong, the answer is still the same. The average person has to right themselves. They have to right their family. They have to become active in their church. They need to expand the influence of that church to their community. And they need to build social organizations built on this virtue, because whether we can bring things together through a revivification of our republic, or whether we have to go our own ways and figure out new forms of social organization, in either instance, inculcating virtue in the next generation is really what's going to guarantee success for those that are doing so.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I encourage you to go read this piece by Oron at theblaze.com. It's incredible. And it's fascinating that we live in a time in which what so many people call freedom is actually something that leads them into slavery.
Absolutely. And we always can say every time that Oron McIntyre comes on the show, everybody leaves a little bit smarter. So thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Chicago might be getting a flashback from 1968. Julio Rosas gives us his forecast for the protests at the DNC next week, just ahead. What's a convention without a protest? Left-wing activists are reportedly planning to protest Kamala Harris's presidential nomination at the Democrat National Convention in Chicago next week. And here to discuss is Julio Rosas, Blaze Media national correspondent. So Julio, why is the far left so up in arms? Aren't they about to get the most diverse presidential candidate in history that we've ever seen? Isn't this what they want?
Yes, to a point, and that's interesting that you bring that up. But the main gripe for this year has been the war in Gaza against Hamas, and so the reason why the far left is organizing for protests all week as opposed to the RNC, which was only one day, is because the Biden-Harris administration has been the one in charge during this war, and obviously there hasn't been a ceasefire, there hasn't been an arms embargo. Which is one of the things that they're calling for, and they're generally supportive of Israel, at least when it comes to rhetoric. So all that combined just doesn't make the far left very happy. And so, like I said, we were there for the RNC. There was only one day of protest, and that was just mainly because Trump hasn't been in charge during this time. And so they put the quote unquote genocide at the feet of the Biden-Harris administration.
Julio, and that hasn't changed over the course of time. I mean, now that we have Harris, I mean, we expected these to be, we've been talking about it for months, right, to be pretty big. You think is it going to change now that Kamala is in charge?
No, and even with Walz, who is from Minnesota and has the backing of the likes of Ilhan Omar and kind of the squad, it hasn't changed, and it's because, I mean, we're dealing with like the furthest of left when it comes to the Democratic coalition. So yes, they were slightly more optimistic with Harris because she hasn't been directly in charge, right? She's number two. They were very unhappy with Biden. But when they had their meeting, the main march, the march on the DNC, when they had their meeting after Harris was named to be at the top of the ticket, they did ask, does anyone have any issue with continuing this planned protest at the DNC? And no one took issue. And so they're going full steam ahead. They still very much blame Harris to be part of the problem in their eyes. And then we saw this recently from last night in New York City when Harris didn't even show up to this fundraiser, but you had top Democrats at the city and national level have a fundraiser for her in Harlem, and the same kind of within our lifetime organization rallied outside, and things were kind of fine. But then when the after party started, and they followed those people inside the restaurant and bars, and that's when things got out of hand. And so I think that's going to be a little bit of a preview of what's to come for the DNC, because it's not just the United Center, but it's also potentially where the delegates and their friends are going to be staying at the hotels in downtown Chicago.
Now, all protests are not created equal, but do you expect this to be more violent than any of the protests that we've seen? We saw a lot of violence in 2020. Do we anticipate that getting back to any of those levels?
I think so. I think one of the friction points, one of the potential flashpoints to get things going in terms of getting violent has been the route. The protesters have argued for a larger route that doesn't have as many turns because they say that's going to create bottlenecks and create a safety hazard. The Secret Service and the city said that they can't accommodate that march, and actually a judge just ruled this week that they are going to permit for the shorter route that the city has put forth, because they also said that by going further along the security perimeter of the United Center, that also can create a hazard because the fencing that they put up is not flexible, right? So if people start getting pushed up against the fencing, it could cause kind of injuries and potential deaths when it comes to a stampede, should something like that happen. And so the reason why I say that is because when Netanyahu spoke last month to Congress, the marchers tried to push past the security line and try to push past officers, and obviously the officers weren't going to allow that, and that was one of the things that kind of kicked things off for turning violent. So it's really anyone's game. I mean, the conditions are being created, and they will be in place for things, because it takes just one little small thing to kick things off. I mean, it could be any number of things, right? So I think with the number of people that are there, the still anger that these people are feeling, I think it has a very high possibility. Again, in weatherman terms, it's definitely over 50%.
Julio, can you explain quick who is organizing these and how they're organizing it on the one side versus how the Democratic Party leaders are planning to respond to it?
So it's things. I mean, we have Code Pink, we have the Answer Coalition, you have the local DSA. There's over 100 organizations that are at a minimum endorsing the march, and then there's going to be obviously people who are going to be participating. There is concern within Democrats. Politico had a good piece out back in May where Democrats are concerned at how Mayor Brandon Johnson is going to allow the police to respond, because the Chicago police superintendent has made it clear that they're not going to tolerate any violence, that if there's any hint of violence, they're going to move in and shut it down quickly. But he has to answer to the mayor. And the mayor is he kind of comes from that far left coalition. He definitely has the sympathies towards the protesters. And in that piece from Politico, there's this joke that unlike the 1968 convention where Mayor Daley basically let the cops do what they had to do to shut things down, the joke is that the mayor is on the side of the protesters this time as opposed to police. And Mayor Brandon Johnson has not been an ally to Chicago police at all during his tenure. He's made that clear. So it will be interesting to see how those dynamics play out, where you have a mayor who is probably going to pressure Chicago police to let protesters get away with as much as they can before probably things get out of hand. So that's why there's so much concern, because it's obviously not just coming from the protesters, but now it's also coming from the top.
Things look fairly unified on the right, with people getting behind Donald Trump. But you mentioned the war at the top between Israel and Hamas, and that leading to some tension. So how do these protests reflect the bigger divisions right now within the Democratic Party?
Well, it speaks to how there is that divide between where they try to have the minority Olympics, right? Because on one hand, you have the Palestinians and Muslim coalition within the United States. And then on the other hand, you have the Jewish, where they have the donors and just the general New York City Jewish support and things like that. That's one of the reasons why kind of these cities have such democratic strongholds. And so that's why Biden had such a hard time responding to this problem. And Harris has had an equally hard time responding to it, because no matter who they even give just a little bit of support to, the other side is just going to go completely ballistic. And so we saw that recently where some protesters in Michigan started to interrupt her during her speech. And she said, yeah, you can keep saying that, but if you want Donald Trump, but I'm speaking right now. And I saw a lot of, again, the far left pro-Palestinian anti-Israel coalition kind of saying, how dare she respond in that way, even though the protesters were interrupting her, right? So it doesn't matter what these people are going to do. It doesn't matter what they choose. Ultimately, it's going to anger a very significant part of the base. And that's why, especially when it comes from the Muslim side of things, Michigan's a must-win state for this upcoming election, and there's a lot of the uncommitted delegates. They're coming from Michigan, and so she has the potential to lose that state over this very issue, and that's why she's tried to be more conciliatory towards their demands. But again, as soon as she did that, with potentially being open to a meeting to have an arms embargo, the Jewish left just, they have their own meltdown over that. So it's a rock and a hard place. I don't envy them, and that's why it's just crazy that from 1968 we kind of have another set of conditions where it can have a very high likelihood it's going to be a chaotic DNC.
I appreciate you bringing that up because, if you're just listening to the mainstream press, you'd think everyone and their mother loves Kamala and there's no dissension whatsoever. But as you rightly point out, this dissension is still there, and that might be surprising to some people. And speaking of which, for those who don't know, since Julio came on, this is sort of your own personal Super Bowl, right? For the year, because this is what you do and you do look forward to it. Nonetheless, you're going to, I assume, be keeping very safe this next week, and we hope it goes well.
Julio, the final word.
Yeah, this is something that I've been looking forward to for over a year. It's basically as soon as I found out that Chicago was going to be where it's going to be held, and with this issue being at the forefront. So we'll be out there. We'll try to get as close to the chaos as we can to show the viewers what it's like. But this is something that I've been anticipating for a very, very, very long time.
Stay safe out there, and we look forward to all of the reporting that you will be doing for us next week at the DNC.
Thanks.
Creative divisions for Batman and Snow White spark backlash from fans. We'll fill you in on how your childhood is being ruined. Don't go anywhere. Amazon Prime's new Batman cartoon gender swapped the villain Penguin to a woman. Why would they do that, you ask? Well, the creator said the move was inspired by a drag queen and numerous musicals. So here to discuss is Ryan Cannell, U.S. Navy veteran and host of RK Outpost on YouTube. So Ryan, thanks for joining us. Now, this move has generated a lot of criticism, and I see a Batman poster behind you. So I need your take on what's happening right now in this series.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. And yeah, it's certainly not the only thing right now in entertainment or the culture war space that seems absolutely insane, but certainly drew heavy criticism. A Batman cartoon that supposedly was supposed to be in the vein and remind people of Batman, the animated series, the beloved cartoon from the 90s. But unfortunately, they decided to put identity politics first and foremost. And this is not the only change. They decided, I guess there's not enough great female villains in the Batman lineup, even though there's several that you can just name off the top of your head. They decided they had to gender swap Penguin. And it wasn't enough to just gender swap Penguin. You mentioned that they said, we were inspired by drag queens. It's a penguin that's grotesque, that's fat, that's ugly, but it's a woman. And if maybe this penguin was using her power to intimidate people, to make them, bend the knee to her, that'd be one thing. But no, everybody just thinks that this disgusting version of penguin's actually attractive. I don't really understand what they thought was going to happen, but certainly they've been at the heavy end of some major criticism, myself included. I've got the Batman poster. I've got the Batmobile right behind me. And I'm not sure why you'd think that this is a good idea, but you take another female villain like Harley Quinn, who's also in this series. What did they do with her? Well, she had to be a lesbian, and they had to race swap her as well. It just goes back to getting into these things that are beloved and pillaging them and bastardizing them for the sake of modern day identity politics.
I think we have to say, not that there's anything wrong with that. Ryan, go ahead, Matt.
Right. Well, of course, there's nothing wrong with all those things mixed together. Anyway, I want to go to something else quick and get your take on it. 2 data points from Disney right now. One, obviously everyone's talking about Snow White, the woke actress, the de-wokeification of Snow White. That's all over the place. Here's the beloved classic, up in flames or not, and they're struggling with it. 2, you may have seen this. That Park Place was talking about the fact that there's still men dressed as women who are, cutting a little girl and boy's hair at the park. And we ran an article a while ago about how There are, the drag queens at Disney. I just want to throw both of those to you and give us your take on where Disney's at now.
Disney as a company for so long has really relied on this aspect of being family friendly. Well, unfortunately, over the past couple years, it's hard to say that this is a company that any family person, anyone with children would describe as family friendly. You brought up what's happening in the theme parks right now. You go there, you might have drag queens dressed as women, or you might go to the Bippity Boppity Boutique. Say you're a family, you spent thousands of dollars to go down and make your little daughter's dreams come true in such a magical way. And you walk up to get her, made over like a princess, and you're greeted by a mustachioed or bearded man who is in a dress. They're going to be the ones that end up doing your daughter's hair, that put makeup on, that dress them. It's just a strange feeling. And no, I'm not going to say no one, but most normal people don't consider that family friendly. They don't want to be involved in that. And this is really becoming a problem for Disney, because the way that they have continued to build this brand and the theme parks have been so big, it's by people going and taking their children, because it's the parents that make these decisions. They take their children, they spend all this money to give them a magical experience. And what happens when that child grows up? They want to pass that down to their children. So they end up with this generational vibe going on. And this is how they've been able to sustain this for so long for this company. That's not going to happen anymore, because half the people in this country are going to be turned off by Disney's inherent political ideology. So when you're talking about the experiences people have in the theme parks, that's a big thing. And people are deciding to go to places like Universal Studios, at least here in Florida. They're taking up the market share from Disney while Disney continues to push this woke nonsense. And certainly on the other aspect, you brought up Snow White. Rachel Zegler has been a complete and total disaster for them. They virtue signaled very hard 3 years ago when they walked her out and said, "We're proud to announce our Latina Snow White. We're so stunning. We're so brave." I'm not sure if they knew she was going to be such a massive problem for them, but from, crapping all over the original Snow White movie to saying it's not 1937 anymore, we're going to put modern day identity politics into this story. We saw the backlash that stemmed from that. And now even just after the debut of yet another teaser trailer for Snow White that got hammered, that got ratioed. It's sitting at over 500,000 dislikes right now on YouTube, compared to only about 70,000 likes. That's not great. And Rachel Zegler, while promoting this trailer, decides to follow up with a very divisive political statement. Oh, and by the way, free Palestine. That is not something I think Disney can be okay with right now.
If only they had been the Biden administration and got rid of all of the dislike buttons on there, their video would have been fine. Ryan, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Peterson, are they ever going to learn? Is Disney ever going to learn? They hear the feedback all the time from people, but yet we still get this.
Well, the good thing is this is finally having an effect. So it is having an effect on the box office. It's having an effect on how much the company is worth. But to your point, I don't think they will. I don't think they will, because no one's going to be brave enough to fire all the people they would have to fire. I just don't see that happening. It would gut the company. So unless Elon Musk buys Disney, which could happen, it's going down.
Well, a Disney property is ESPN, and they fired Sam Ponder, one of their most popular talents. And we're going to be breaking all of that down and so much more here tomorrow.